Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the inaugural Clifford Newbold Memorial Lecture here at Wentworth Woodhouse. I first met Mr Newbold in 2012, about 3 days before we actually opened to the public. I'd previously been here in 2008 with a different place of employment. Now, Mr Newbold, they had been at a family lunch, they were looking through the newspapers, they saw that Wentworth Woodhouse was up for sale. They were looking for a development opportunity. Mr Newbold had retired, he'd gone to live on Guernsey. I think he found life on Guernsey very insular. He didn't like it. He came back to London. London born and bred, they lived at Highgate. He was a successful architect. One of the architectural things that he did was the Dungeness Lighthouse, which is now listed. And they were looking for this retirement development project. They liked the look of Wentworth, they came up to view it, they fell in love with the place, and as I said, Mr Newbold came out of retirement to oversee its restoration and move it forward. A story that he always used to tell was that when the sale had been completed, he was summoned from London to be given the key to the door. He came up and he was most disappointed that he was given a Yale lock, a Yale key. When eventually they moved in, they looked around and everything else, and eventually they managed to find the key to the door. And actually, from when we opened in 2012 till sadly when he died in 2015, in fact probably to the day before he died, any visitors that he came across, he would tell them the story about the Yale lock and being so disappointed but eventually finding the key to the door. Now the key leads on to what we're here for tonight. Matthew Hirst from Curator down at Woburn Abbey, one of our trustees here on the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust, has done work on Henry Flitcroft that was the architect of this wonderful house. Got to say, I don't know much about Flickcroft, and I'm hoping to learn a lot more. And hopefully you will enjoy, as we said, this memorial lecture on behalf of the late Mr Clifford Newbold. Over to you.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be here. And I'm going to talk to you about Flickcroft, but also talk to you about the impact, really, that Flickcroft had on two houses, one of which I'm a trustee, Wentworth Woodhouse, and the other where I am the curator at Woburn Abbey, both of which were designed by Henry Flitcroft, or parts of them were. And it's a wider story, and it's one that when I come here, one of the reasons why when I come here I actually feel rather at home, because when I look around me I see lots of details which are very familiar because they also exist at Woburn. And there are very good reasons for that, which I will go into a little bit during the course of my lecture this evening. So my first slide really, just to set the scene and show you these two houses side by side, or rather one on top of the other. Wentworth on the top of the screen and Woburn Abbey on the bottom, both set in beautiful deer parks in that sort of wonderful Arcadian English tradition of the English country house. Now, hopefully. Aha. We had this problem before. So, isn't it? Let's try that again. There we are. So I thought I should, you all know Wentworth very well, but I thought that perhaps you might not know Woburn so well. So before I go in to talk more about Flickcroft and the architecture, I just thought I would give you an overview, an introduction into Woburn Abbey. So here it is photographed in at about 2019, just before we closed for our own major project. We're undergoing a huge refurbishment project, very similar in some respects to the work that has been going on here at Wentworth with the Preservation Trust. Woburn Abbey is the seat, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Bedford, and it has been in their ownership ever since it was given to them in the will of Henry VIII in 1547. It wasn't always their principal home, however. It was a subsidiary estate. Just to demonstrate some of the work that we're doing, this is an announcement from our refurbishment when we closed in 2019. And two artists' impressions of two of the rooms which we will be restoring to their, in fact, 17th century appearance. And I'll go into a little bit more about that in a moment. But Woburn Abbey was one of a number of properties gifted in Henry VIII's will to the man on the far left of the screen, Sir John Russell, who was then ennobled by Edward VI to become the first Earl of Bedford. You can see there the various properties marked in red, spread around basically the sort of Midlands and down into the southwest. And it was actually the southwest from which the Russell family, Russell is the surname, originated. But Woburn, as I said, was not really regarded as the principal family residence really until the 17th century. And I should say that, in fact, it was a Cistercian monastery. And so one of the reasons why it was given by Henry was that up until the Reformation, it had been a Cistercian monastery, a daughter house of Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, and was then obviously taken by the state during the Reformation and then gifted by Henry in his will to Sir John Russell. But the man that you see on the far left in portrait by Van Dyke is Francis Russell, who was the fourth Earl of Bedford. And he was the important figure in terms of making Woburn home. Up until then, it had been effectively a semi-ruinous range of former monastic buildings. But he decided to rejuvenate it, and he created a house out of the remains of the monastery. And the image on the right shows you an imagined view from 1931 by Rudolf Schwabe, but taken from all of the documentation that we have in the archives at Woburn. And the sort of the wing, if you like, that's nearest to you is important because that still stands today. And those two artists' impressions that I showed you in my earlier slide are two of the rooms from that part of the abbey. And in the centre, between those two rooms, is this room, which is perhaps our most important interior. It is an entirely unique shell-lined grotto. So the walls and the ceiling, every surface is encrusted with shells, all indigenous to the British Isles. And this was created for the fourth Earl in around 1630. Now, traditionally, there was a name of an architect, the father of English classicism, that was associated with Woburn, although, in fact, we now don't believe he actually designed anything there. But you will have heard of him, I think, Indigo Jones. And he really is the man responsible for bringing classicism to England in the 17th century. This room, at the heart of that suite of apartments, was this kind of fantastical shell-lined room designed for entertaining, connecting to the garden, and it's here presumably that people would have come to then go out and exercise in the garden, having perhaps dined. And it's meant to make us all think of the wonderful rooms that were created in Renaissance Italy. That's where the inspiration comes from, and we'll be returning to Italy in a moment. But an important point to make about the family is that the Russell family did in fact commission Indigo Jones to create Covent Garden in London. So Covent Garden Piazza, that where the market always was and where there is now the sort of covered area in the centre. That was all built by the Bedford or the Russell family. And St Paul's Church, which you see on the far side of the image there, was designed by Indigo Jones together with the arcades around. And this is the first classical formal square in London, which then sets the pattern for all of the architectural development in London after that date. And this is taken from a painting in the collections at Woburn Abbey showing the Covent Garden market happening there in the centre of the piazza. Oh dear. So I'm going to have to jump forward. But I promised you a little trip to Italy, and it's perhaps important to comment on where did Indigo Jones get his understanding of classical architecture. Well, Indigo Jones went on a grand tour. He went to Italy and he studied firsthand architecture of all of the 16th and 17th century, but also antique architecture. But principally, he understood it through this publication, which you see here, which is Andrea Palladio, the Italian architect, Quattro Libra, his 4 books of architecture. And we know that Indigo Jones purchased these books and he used them and he understood what Andrea Palladio was doing, which was really the true revival of classical architecture in Italy. And you can see here some of Palladio's buildings from Venice and the Veneto, so the Redentore Church, which was built to mark the recovery of Venice from a great plague, and the Villa Rotonda in the Veneto, which is really probably his most famous classical villa, built there for a rich family as their country residence away from the city. And on the right-hand side, you can see a very similar building proposed by Palladio. So Indigo Jones knew Palladio and he knew his work and he understood classical architecture. And he brought it to England. Other people also went to Italy and understood this classical architecture. And in fact, one of the successors of the 4th Earl of Bedford, who ultimately in fact became the 4th Duke of Bedford, this is the successor, was John Russell. And he went on a grand tour of Italy in 1731 when he was still Lord Russell. And as part of his grand tour, he stopped in Venice. Venice was always the high point of any grand tour because it was where you could let your hair down, you could relax, you could enjoy the festivities, the annual festivity of the Marriage of the Sea on Ascension Day, where effectively the leader of Venice would go out on his barge, throw a ring into the sea to signify this unique relationship that Venice as a city, an independent city-state, had. And it's important politically to just sort of remember that for a little bit later on. Whilst John Russell was there, he purchased, he instructed that he was going to purchase a group of works by the famous painter Canaletto, who effectively provided these wonderful images of Venice that English aristocrats could take home to remind them of their grand tour. And still today at Woburn we have 24 paintings by Canaletto in the collection. And this is a little selfish plug here for an exhibition which will open on the 1st of April. So during our closure we've been undertaking various projects to make sure that our collections are still accessible to the public. And so on the 1st of April you can go to the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich and see all 24 Canalettos in a new exhibition about Canaletto's Venice Revisited, which will explore the Grand Tour and that whole impact of tourism on this great city, but also the impact that that great city and indeed Palladio had on the architecture of England. The button's not going to work, so I shall come back here. So jumping back to Indigo Jones, what did he do for England? Well, he brought the first true classical architecture. And if you see top of the screen, the 2 images there is the Queen's House at Greenwich. It's now part of the National Maritime Museum. And this was designed by Indigo Jones for the Queen, and you can see the exterior there, very sombre, very ordered, very stable. There's no drama that you might expect with Baroque architecture, or indeed no Gothicism that you would expect with medieval architecture. And I hope that the interior on the right-hand side of the screen will show a relationship that you will be all only too familiar with Wentworth Woodhouse, because effectively the great marble saloon is an even larger version of that sort of interior, which is a direct quotation from Palladio and Palladianism as it becomes known. And below that is the great banqueting house in Whitehall, which was also designed by Indigo Jones, and the interior there, which is furnished with this great series of paintings by Rubens, which effectively illustrate the glorification of James I of England. So this is after Queen Elizabeth, and the succession passes to James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of England, and they build, as part of the court around them, the new Stuart court, they build these great buildings to express their understanding and taste of true classical architecture. And I mention politics because ultimately the architecture that we are all familiar with here at Wentworth Woodhouse, but also at Woburn and through so many classical buildings in this country, is driven by a political agenda. And so this is just a family tree of the line of succession of the royal family. So at the very top you have James VI of Scotland and First of England, and then it comes down on the right, Charles I, then we have the interregnum, and then with the Restoration in 1660 we have Charles II, and then it passes to William of Orange and Queen Mary, eventually on to Queen Anne, and because Queen Anne had no heir and they didn't want the line of succession to continue down through James II's line, which was Catholic, they elected to effectively invite George I from Hanover, a good sort of sidestep, if you like, within the family tree. But he was Protestant, and what this brought was a new sort of style into England. So after the Restoration with Charles II, architecture, the sort of period of Indigo Jones had waned with the Commonwealth, and we followed the Baroque tradition. We were captivated by Louis XIV of France. We wanted to be better than him, to emulate his architectural style, which was very theatrical, very dramatic, and very Baroque. And that then leads me really to talk about Wentworth, because of course the west front of Wentworth, which you will all be very familiar with, really belongs to that Baroque phase of English architecture. And I show on the left a little inset detail from the west front, which shows these giant pilasters that march over 2 stories, that creates a sense of drama, and it's got more movement, more mannerism within the facade than we saw, if you remember, the Queen's House facade, which was so precise, so ordered, so regular. And it's interesting to ponder that this facade was built after 1716, after the succession of George I, and just at a moment when there was a reaction against this Baroque architecture. And I'll come on to that in a moment. And I think it's no surprise that we can relate the west front of Wentworth Woodhouse to other great Baroque buildings in this country, principally, of course, Castle Howard, which really expounds that idea of drama and theatre and the Baroque, which you can see here. And this is all very much inspired by the court architecture of Louis XIV in France. But in 1715, there was a very important publication, Vitruvius Britannicus, or The British Architect, which was published by Colin Campbell, an architect, but it was as much a book on architecture as a book about making sure that we all understood what the correct type of architecture would be for our political standpoint. And I talked about Venice. Venice was admired by the English because it was an independent city-state. It had an elected leader, and it was self-governing, and it wasn't controlled in the way that other countries and states were controlled in mainland Europe. And this political idea appealed to the English. In particular, it appealed to the Whigs. And of course, we know that Wentworth Woodhouse was a great Whig house under the first and second Marquess of Rockingham as they became. And this publication really was pitching the sort of style, the visual identity, if you like, the brand of the Whigs versus the Tories, and this idea of Baroque architecture with all of its movement and flourishes and drama, compared with this image on the bottom of the screen, which is in fact Wanstead House in Essex. And this was really sort of held up as being a true expression of classical architecture. And we've gone back to that classical language that Indigo Jones had so successfully brought to England at the beginning of the 17th century, but then had been interrupted by the Commonwealth period, the interregnum, and then we got distracted, of course, by the glories of Louis XIV and all of the glitter and gold of France. And that was the style that we emulated. Now, Wanstead is an interesting building. It doesn't survive, sadly. And here you can see a painted view of it, because it has a connection between this house and the house where I am employed, because architecturally, I'm sure you can all see the relationship between the east front of Wentworth Woodhouse and the principal facade of Wanstead House. For me, the connection comes because the man who built that, Josiah Child, his granddaughter, Elizabeth, married the man who became the second Duke of Buckingham, the second Duke of Bedford. So the architectural expression and taste that you can see at Wanstead House has a direct family connection for the Bedfords at Woburn through the marriage of Elizabeth Howland into the Russell family. And you can see the portraits on the left is Josiah Child, and on the right is Elizabeth Howland with her new husband, who ultimately would become the second Duke of Bedford. So there's a direct connection, and the point I want to illustrate here is this large piece of symmetrical water in front of the house with this very formal planting, because in the early 18th century, the second Duke of Bedford was busy changing the park at Woburn and creating a formal circular piece of water, which is what you can see in the centre of that image, in front of the house, which is the rectangular area on the right-hand side of that circular piece of water, with a great avenue marching through, creating the same perspective, the same setting that we can see at Wanstead. So there's a direct correspondence between the two. But the buildings at Woburn were still effectively former monastic buildings that had been adapted and modernised and had two wings added in the sort of Indigo Jones style. And just to show you how perhaps chaotic that plan would have been, this is a plan made in 1733, in fact for the new fourth Duke of Bedford, when he inherited. And you can see on the left 3 rooms, of which the central one, bottom left, is the grotto, that shell-lined room that I showed you earlier on. But next to that, you can see effectively what looks like it could almost be a church, with buttresses coming out, and this is the remains of the monastic fabric. So all of that continued to exist, and it wasn't until the mid-18th century that that changed. Here is a survey drawing showing the west front of Woburn, which is very different to that photograph that I showed you from 2019, right at the beginning of my talk. So you can see elements of classicism creeping in. You've got a nice portico door in the middle there. You've got sort of round-headed windows trying to sort of create that idea of symmetry on either side. But all the bit in the middle is effectively modernised monastery. And when the 4th Duke inherited in 1732, he decided that he wanted to do something about that. A little bit like Thomas Watson Wentworth wanted to do something about the architectural style here at Wentworth Woodhouse. So John Sanderson, perfectly good architect, created a number of different proposals for him in 1733. This is one of them, but this has all the trademark elements of the Baroque, which by this point politically would have been the wrong style to build in the same way that it was really the wrong style to have built the east front of Wentworth Woodhouse in, considering your sort of political viewpoints and your aspirations. So here we have giant pilasters marching over 2 stories. We have a great big dome over the centre, reminiscent of that dome that we saw at Castle Howard. Far too much movement, far too much drama. And I think the 4th Duke was striving for something different. And the next image is an alternative design created again by Sanderson, so clearly an adept architect, but this shows a much more restrained, much more tight, much more ordered building, such as the Queen's House or indeed as Wanstead House, and you have this great temple front which could easily be picked up and transferred onto the east front of Wentworth Woodhouse. And this is the sort of style that the 4th Duke of Bedford was striving for. However, he wasn't in a position to completely rebuild straight away. And it wasn't until 1747 that he got underway with his work. And by that point, he had commissioned Henry Flitcroft rather than John Sanderson to deliver his vision. So what of Henry Flitcroft? Well, Henry Flitcroft had relatively humble beginnings, and it was perhaps due to an accident that he was put into the eye of this man, Richard Boyle, 3rd Earl of Burlington, because Henry Flitcroft was employed on some building works at Burlington House in Piccadilly, which is today where the Royal Academy is, which was the London house of this man, and he was perhaps the great champion of the revival of true Palladianism in England after the 1715 publication of Vitruvius Britannicus. And the building on the left there is his villa that he created for himself at Chiswick, just outside London. And this was basically added on to a huge Jacobean house. So it would have looked very, very different to the building that it was connected to. That building was much later demolished in the 18th century. But this, I hope you can see the connection right the way back to the Veneto, to Palladio, to those wonderful country retreats that were created for the wealthy aristocrats living in Venice. So a little bit of Italy brought to the outskirts of London. And this is exactly what the publication of Vitruvius Britannicus, but also the prime movers of taste, which ultimately was the third Earl of Burlington wanted us to be seeing. And similar work was going on at Burlington House in Piccadilly, and here is Henry Flitcroft, painted much later in life. Once he was a successful architect, you can see he has the instruments of his trade in his hands. And here on the right is a satirical cartoon of the day, which was effectively poking fun at the idea that this man was, that the Earl of Burlington and the sort of group of people he had assembled around him at Burlington House was directing the taste of the country. And one of those other people, in fact, was William Kent, the great designer, perhaps the first man who truly combined interior decoration, as we might call it today, furniture and all of the other accoutrements of the interior with the architecture so that you had a cohesive whole. And so this cartoon is poking fun at that, but I sort of put it in because the accident that happened was that Henry Flitcroft fell from a scaffolding, perhaps not dissimilar to the one we see here, whilst working at Burlington House, and broke his leg. And whilst his leg was broken, he picked up his pencil and was drawing. And apparently, so the story goes, his drawings were spotted by the third Earl of Burlington and William Kent, and they realised he was a talented draftsman. They then effectively fostered him and developed his work and provided him with the nourishment to ultimately become a great architect. And so Henry Flitcroft really becomes the successor to the third Earl of Burlington and William Kent in terms of bringing true Palladianism to England. So if we come back home, so to speak, back to Wentworth Woodhouse, I wanted to show you some of the relationships between this building and Woburn Abbey, both designed by Henry Flitcroft, although more than 10 years apart. This is much earlier in Flitcroft's career than Woburn, and yet we can see that he's ultimately using the same pattern book, if you like, i.e. he's understood classical architecture to the point where he can lift different elements, combine them in different ways to create a truly classical interior. So I've already mentioned the relationship between the east front of Wentworth Woodhouse and Wanstead House in Essex here, just to really remind us of that. And of course, Wanstead was held up, particularly in Vitruvius Britannicus, as being the ultimate pure expression of what we should be building. And here, 10 years later, is John, 4th Duke of Bedford, with his architectural plans on the table there, pointing his finger at what he was going to build, and conveniently for me, his other hand is pointing at this rather wonderful country life photograph from the 1950s, which shows the west front of Woburn Abbey reflected in the now naturalised pool of water which was formed out of that great circular pond that I showed you in that early survey of the estate. So I'm going to show you a number of images, and just to give you a clue, the images on the left of the screen are going to be Wentworth, and the images on the right of the screen are going to be Woburn. And you might now start to understand why I feel so comfortable when I come here, because Flickcroft is effectively just tweaking his menu, his expressions through different flourishes, but ultimately giving us a similar understood classical format which they proportionally would have believed to be correct, and is all inspired by ultimately by Palladio and classical antiquity. So on the left you have the pillared hall at Wentworth Woodhouse, and on the right, from a country life photograph of the 1950s, the West Hall at Woburn Abbey. Both on the ground floor, both the sort of principal entry point, There's no external stair at Woburn in the way that there is on the east front here. So this is the way that people would have come into the building. And it gives us that familiar language. We know that those columns must be holding something up, something serious above them. And although they're Tuscan on the left and Ionic on the right, Doric on the left and Ionic on the right, that's just a slightly different order, but ultimately it's all proper classical architecture. We can see the same relationships between interior decoration. Here on the left you have the painted room just next door, here at Wentworth Woodhouse, and on the right a design for a ceiling on the ground floor just off that west hall at Woburn Abbey. Exactly the same compartmentation, the same delineation, just a little bit of variety in the detail. So the ceiling at Woburn introduces some sort of naturalistic flourishes of foliage and shells, which is much more restrained on the Wentworth example. But effectively, he could almost have thought, I've got to design a ceiling, let's see what can we do, here we are, and so on. So it's taking the accepted rules of classical architecture and then modifying them for a different purpose, but ultimately sticking within those rules. One feature of Palladian architecture is what we call a continued chimney piece, i.e. you have the chimney piece, which is effectively the stone or marble surround to the fireplace, but then it has a superstructure, and this is one of the great details that was within the interiors of Wanstead House, and you can see them when you go to Wilton and various other houses of the same period, and indeed the Queen's House at Greenwich. Often that would be built in timber, and often it would be effectively the receptacle of a great piece of art, a painting, or indeed in some instances a sculpture. And in fact we have one here behind the screen, a continued chimney piece. The one on the left from Wentworth Woodhouse, from the painted room next door, the one on the right from the same room that I showed you the ceiling design for, and you can see it has a broken pediment at the top with a Rococo cartouche. And it's interesting that there are flourishes. You can feel that, that freer style that ultimately becomes the Rococo. So the Palladianism starts to wane into the middle of the 18th century. And again, we start turning back to France for our inspiration, and everything becomes much more naturalistic, less formal, less ordered. And so you get these little details, but ultimately it is an architectural form with a pediment. It could be a building effectively, or an archway, an opening, a door, but it becomes the display place for a great piece of art. And there is just another example. On the left, the continued chimney piece from the Whistlejacket room here, and on the right, the continued chimney piece from the state dining room at Woburn, which just happens to also contain nothing but Van Dyke portraits. So another nice relationship between here, the Van Dyke room here, and a Van Dyke room at Woburn. And I mentioned William Kent and this idea of somebody effectively being able to provide you every service that you require in order to end up with a perfectly functioning, furnished interior at the end of your project. So on the right, the saloon at Woburn, and you can see between the windows these great architectural statement pier glasses with giltwood frames. Above them there are roundels with antique heads, Faustina and Vespasian, people like this from antiquity. And if you look to the right, the Whistlejacket room here, and between the windows you have almost the same form of pier glass, again with these portrait roundels above, and then with this ornament that carries on up the wall. And this was an idea that William Kent really sort of championed and made into a sort of formula which then gets picked up by Flickcroft and used here and at Woburn and at many other houses that he worked in. And although we don't have his drawings for these mirrors, we do have drawings within the archives at Woburn for tables that would have stood under mirrors and other pieces of furniture that would have decorated the room that were intended to be part of this entire ensemble, which becomes the sort of interior that we would recognise today. But it goes down to the tiniest of details, and all of these details come from classical antiquity as interpreted by Palladio and Indigo Jones and others. So on the left you have a chimney piece, I think it's from the Van Dyck room, and you can see carved in the marble these lions' heads, the lion holding a ring in its mouth from which descends a garland of fruit and flowers. Here in the West Hall at Woburn, the same detail, but just picked up and moved into the upper structure. So again, I talked about this menu of ornament that they would be able to interpret and use for different purposes, but ultimately has all of its origins in classical antiquity. So a nice relationship there. Another ceiling comparison, the long gallery here at Wentworth on the left and at Woburn on the right, and the drawing shown here from the archives at Woburn, which shows that central compartment of the ceiling, and I'm sure you can start to see the relationships between both. And a great enfilade of rooms, here on the left Wentworth, here on the right Woburn. So I really do feel very comfortable when I come here, so much so that I could almost mistake one staircase for another. And I say all of this, I don't want to make light of what Flickcroft is doing. And in fact, Flickcroft was an important draftsman. My caption has been cut off here, but this is taken from some designs by Indigo Jones and others, which was published by Burlington and illustrated by Henry Flitcroft. So all of these drawings would have been made originally by Flickcroft, which were then engraved and printed in the book. And here on the right, the long gallery door case from Woburn Abbey. So he really was a very skilled draftsman and understood how to use all of the ornament. That's where my caption went. And one of the most significant publications that happened, which was perhaps a little late for Wentworth, but just in time for Woburn, was the publication by Robert Wood of the ruins of Palmyra, where he had gone and drawn and surveyed all of the antique buildings in Palmyra. This is the ceiling here on the left from that publication of 1753, as engraved or as drawn and then subsequently engraved by Robert Wood. And on the right-hand side, a view of the state bedroom at Woburn, and you can see it's a carbon copy almost of that antique ceiling. And all of these references would have been understood by the people who went round these buildings, people such as Horace Walpole, the great critique, who went round houses and wrote little summaries. In fact, he'd been round Woburn before it was rebuilt by the fourth Duke and was quite waspish about some of the interiors. Hopefully he might have been more suitably impressed after the fourth Duke's great works. And then bringing us to another example, there are obviously a number of great Flickcroft houses, but this is the long gallery here at Wimpole Hall on the right, on the left, sorry, and on the right, the long gallery again from Woburn, just to show you again, he's just changing the details, but ultimately working within a formula which he understands and a proportion which he understands, which is all derived from classical antiquity. And Palladianism as a style has been so successful and so ubiquitous with order and a sense of dignity and clarity, that it has been the chosen style really for political architecture, and particularly in America for public buildings ever since. And on the left-hand side of the screen you can see the Capitol building in Washington as originally conceived. It was then it was partially destroyed by fire and then rebuilt at various stages and extended during the 19th century. But that original building, in the detail, take the dome off and it starts to feel a little bit like Wanstead House in Essex, or indeed Wentworth Woodhouse. So you can see that this formula, this great order that's created through the classical style, has its impacts felt time and time again around the world, and Woburn and Wentworth Woodhouse are just two expressions of that. And that carries on today. This is the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, completed in 1974 as the showcase for Getty's great collection of antiquities that he had acquired, and is now a great public institution. You can visit it and see real treasures from the classical world set in effectively what is a complete, faithful replica of a true Roman villa as you would have experienced it in classical antiquity, but it just happens to be in Malibu in California. And finally, just to bring it more up to date even still, this style so influential and so popular, and now thanks to people like Flickcroft and the 3rd Earl of Burlington and William Kent, so ubiquitous with the English country house and this Arcadian image of how that world of classical antiquity might have looked. Here is Henbury Hall in Cheshire, completed in 1986, but if you just closed your eyes partially and imagined you could be back in the Veneto on a glorious Italian summer, avoiding the heat in central Venice, and soaking up the atmosphere of the classical world as revived through Palladio and then in England through Indigo Jones, the 3rd Earl of Burlington and Henry Flitcroft. And at that I will draw my talk to a close, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
I'm sure you've all enjoyed that very interesting and informative talk, especially the comparisons with other country houses that really we don't realise, but is certainly out there for us to sort of go and visit. So, any questions for Matthew?
Stunned silence.
No, somebody's got to say something.
Was there a reason why, having ditched all the French fancy previously, they actually went back to it?
I think, well, partly fashion, and in 17, one major event happened. So the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. In fact, the 4th Duke of Bedford was the diplomat who went over to Paris to negotiate the peace treaty, which ended the 7 Years' War. And that brought Paris and France back into our consciousness, and therefore, we weren't at war with France anymore, so it was acceptable to enjoy those the style and so on. And of course, by that point, by the 1760s, the Rococo was in full force in France. In fact, if anything, France was ahead of us and was moving towards what we call the Goût grec, the Greek style, which ultimately then becomes neoclassicism in the 1780s and 1790s. So Yeah, it's fashion, but it is influenced by what's going on politically. And what's interesting at Woburn, which I didn't show you, is that there are some interiors, two interiors, which are designed in the French Rococo style, but before 1763. So, in a way, the fourth Duke was sort of slightly ahead of the game there. And he certainly, when he came back from Paris, brought lots of French decorative arts back, many of which are still in Woburn Abbey today.
Lady down there.
Yes. It's interesting what you say about influence and the architect was sort of reused, cut and pasting bits of buildings. Do you think there was any influence between the people involved, so the dukes and the earls? Would they be visiting each other, or would that not have?
No, absolutely they would, and they would have understood the buildings that each other were building, and I mean, as you had that sort of great sparring, I suppose is the best word, between the families here, the two Wentworths, in a different way, perhaps not quite so overtly competitive. Other builders would have been definitely sort of keeping an eye on who was building what and who could build it better, or more correctly, perhaps.
Or bigger.
Or bigger, as in the case here.
Val online asks, what are the most important differences between Wentworth and Woburn?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I think there are a huge number of similarities, and even, you know, I haven't talked about the 20th century, but, you know, both houses, as is the case with so many houses during the 20th century, and particularly the middle of the 20th century, in the period after the Second World War, faced, you know, either near destruction or loss. And at Woburn, that took the form of half the abbey being knocked down in 1949, and so the abbey that we know today is in fact almost half the size it was before or just after the Second World War. And that you have to look at that in the political climate of the day, and in the same way that the huge impact of the sort of mid-20th century here at Wentworth Woodhouse, just in a different form, a different way. So there are those sort of comparisons that you can draw. I suppose fundamentally the great difference between the two houses is that one is still occupied by the family who built it, and the other is not. But that is, as we know, a consequence of the 20th century. So yes, but I think, you know, they're both very rich in their own histories, and that's the great thing about the English country house. Generally, is you get these wonderful in-depth histories, and each house has its own stories, which we enjoy finding out about.
Anyone else? I've got one.
Go on.
Which do you prefer, Baroque or Palladian?
Ooh, now there's a good question. Well,
down there you've got Sutter and you've got Chatsworth.
So I used to work at Chatsworth, and that's very Baroque.
Waddesdon over the top.
Yeah, very different altogether. Palladianism is comfortable in the sense that it's reassuring. It's in that sense that it's ordered, and there's no surprises. I think you know what to expect. Whereas the drama that you get with a Baroque interior, particularly, I mean, if you go to, you know, interiors by Bernini and Borromini in Italy, you know, the drama that you get there is very different, and perhaps you feel more like you've got your feet on the ground with Palladianism.
Right. As we thank Matthew.
Oh, we have one more question.
Going to add to that, I'm a tour guide here at the house, and the feeling that I get is that people, when I'm taking them around, much prefer the Baroque side. They think it's a lot cosier and family orientated, rather than this very severe east front of the house.
Do you think?
The general feeling I seem to get from people.
Do you think that might be partly due to the difference in scale?
It could well be. It could be very.
because these rooms on this side are enormous.
Yeah, it's in your face.
Yeah.
You know you put into something bigger and really special, whereas that looks a bit more manageable, perhaps.
Livable.
Yeah.
Well, and it's no accident that the family always gravitated towards those apartments.
Caesar's first Marcus's time.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anyone else? Sorry about that, lady. Right, ladies and gentlemen, just before we thank Matthew again for really a very interesting and informative talk, remember this talk is part of the series that we're running here at Wentworth over the next few weeks. I think the next one is in a fortnight.
Yeah.
And that will be Dorian again talking about the Camellia House and its development and sort of what's happening up there. If you've not booked, come and see us, book online. Remember, Steve and his team of our digital department is sort of doing it so people can watch it on Zoom the day after, if you feel that you don't want to come out. But please, take note of them and hopefully we'll see you again, possibly with Matthew, here at Woodhouse. But thanks to Matthew for tonight's talk.
Thank you. Thank you.